The wind howled through the harsh Wyoming territory like a wolf seeking vengeance as Tabitha Turner clutched her threadbare shawl tighter around her trembling shoulders. Winter of 1879 showed no mercy to the unprepared, and she was as unprepared as they came. Her stagecoach had been ambushed by bandits 3 miles back, the driver shot dead, and the other passengers scattered to the winds. She alone had survived by hiding in a ravine, but survival now seemed like a cruel joke as the temperature plummeted with the setting sun. "I refuse to die like this," Tabitha whispered through chattering teeth, her voice lost to the uncaring wilderness. At 22, she had already endured more than most: the loss of her parents to fever in Boston, the betrayal of her fiancé who'd run off with her inheritance. And now, this desperate journey west to claim the teaching position that was her last hope. Her fingers had long since gone numb, and each step through the deepening snow felt like walking on broken glass. The first flakes of new snow began to fall as darkness fully claimed the land. Tabitha stumbled, fell to her knees, and fought back tears of frustration. She had been walking for hours with no sign of civilization. The meager provisions in her reticule, a single biscuit and half a flask of water, would not sustain her through the night. Her fine city clothes, chosen for making a good impression rather than wilderness survival, now seemed laughably inadequate. A wolf howled in the distance, the sound echoing across the valley and sending shivers of primal fear down Tabitha's spine. She forced herself to her feet once more, knowing that to stop moving meant certain death. The snow was falling faster now, already blanketing the ground in a fresh layer of white that obscured the faint trail she'd been following. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her completely, Tabitha spotted a faint orange glow in the distance, wavering against the blackness of the night. A fire, civilization, hope. Her frozen legs found new strength as she pushed forward, stumbling through snowdrifts that reached her knees in places. The light grew brighter, and soon she could make out the silhouette of a small cabin, smoke curling from its chimney like a promise of warmth. Tabitha's relief was short-lived. As she approached, a massive dog-no, a wolf, emerged from the shadows near the cabin's door, its eyes reflecting the firelight like twin lanterns. It growled, a low, rumbling sound that stopped her in her tracks. She stood frozen, afraid to advance or retreat as the cabin door swung open. A man's silhouette filled the doorway, tall and imposing against the golden light behind him. He held a rifle in one hand with casual familiarity, like it was an extension of his arm. "Who goes there?" His voice was deep, rough as gravel, yet with an undercurrent of command that spoke of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Please," Tabitha managed, her words barely audible through her trembling lips. "I'm lost. The stage was attacked. I've been walking for hours." The man stepped forward, and the firelight from within the cabin illuminated his features. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. A thick beard covered his jaw, and piercing eyes studied her with suspicion from beneath the brim of a worn cowboy hat. "You're half frozen," he observed, lowering his rifle slightly. "Where'd you come from?" "Boston, originally," Tabitha answered, swaying on her feet as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. "But the stage was coming from Cheyenne. I'm to be the new schoolteacher in Silvercreek." The man's eyebrows rose slightly, but before he could respond, Tabitha's legs finally gave out. She collapsed into the snow, darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw was the stranger handing his rifle to someone inside the cabin and striding toward her through the deepening snow. When Tabitha next opened her eyes, she was enveloped in blessed warmth. For a moment, she wondered if she had died and gone to heaven, but the ache in her limbs and the soreness in her throat quickly dispelled that notion. She was wrapped in several thick furs on a narrow cot near a roaring fireplace. Her wet clothes had been replaced with an oversized men's shirt and woolen trousers rolled up at the ankles. Panic flared as she wondered who had undressed her, but a quick glance around the cabin revealed a woman seated at her rough-hewn table, grinding something in a mortar. You're awake, the woman said, looking up. She was Native American, perhaps in her 50s, with deep lines etched around kind eyes. I was beginning to worry. I am Mourning Dove. Tabitha Turner, she replied automatically, her voice raspy. Thank you for helping me. It was not I who found you, but Gray, Mourning Dove replied, pouring something steaming from a pot into a cup. She brought it to Tabitha. Drink, it will help with the cold in your bones. Tabitha accepted the cup, inhaling the unfamiliar herbal scent before taking a cautious sip. The liquid was bitter but warming, spreading heat through her chest. Gray, she asked, memories of the bearded man surfacing. Garrett Steele, Mourning Dove clarified. This is his cabin. I am helping while his injury heals. As if summoned by his name, the door swung open, bringing a blast of cold air and the man himself. Snow dusted his shoulders and hat, which he removed upon entering. Without it, Tabitha could see that his hair was dark brown, not gray as his name might suggest, with streaks of silver at the temples despite his relatively young age. His eyes met hers, intense and assessing. You're awake. Good. He stomped snow from his boots before approaching. You nearly died out there, Miss Turner. Tabitha clutched the furs closer, suddenly aware of her state of undress beneath the borrowed clothes. How do you know my name? You told me before you fainted, he said, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. And Mourning Dove went through your reticule to see if you had any identification or medicine. Hope you don't mind. No, of course not, Tabitha replied, though she did mind just a little. I'm grateful for your help, Mr. Steele. Once the storm passes, I'll be on my way to Silvercreek. Garrett Steele made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. The storm won't pass for days, Miss Turner, and even if it did, Silvercreek is 30 miles from here. You wouldn't make it half that distance on foot. Mourning Dove approached Garrett, speaking softly. I must return to my son's home before the snow gets worse. You will care for her, Garrett nodded, his expression softening slightly when he looked at the older woman. I'll manage. Thank you for your help, Mourning Dove. After Mourning Dove had bundled up and departed, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Tabitha watched as Garrett moved about, adding wood to the fire, checking something in a pot that hung over the flames. There was an economy to his movements, efficient and purposeful, though she noticed he favored his left leg. What happened to the other passengers? She finally asked. Don't know, he replied without looking up. Found no one else when I tracked back along your trail this morning. Just dead horses and an empty coach. He paused, finally turning to face her. You're lucky. Bandits in these parts don't usually leave witnesses. Perhaps they thought the cold would finish what they started, Tabitha said, a shiver running through her that had nothing to do with temperature. Garrett nodded grimly. Likely so. He ladled something from the pot into a wooden bowl. Can you sit up to eat? With effort, Tabitha managed to prop herself against the wall. Her limbs felt leaden, and her fingertips tingled painfully as circulation returned. Garrett brought the bowl some kind of stew and set it on a small table beside the cot. Thank you, she said, reaching for the spoon. Her hand trembled so badly that she nearly dropped it. Without comment, Garrett sat on the edge of the cot and took the spoon from her. He dipped it into the stew and held it to her lips. Tabitha wanted to protest, to insist she wasn't an invalid, but hunger won out over pride. She allowed him to feed her several spoonfuls before finding her voice again. You live here alone, Mr. Steele. Just Steele is fine, he corrected. Or Garrett if you must, and yes, I do prefer it that way. What about Mourning Dove? She's Shoshone, lives with her son's family about 5 miles east, comes by when she can to check on my leg. He offered another spoonful, which Tabitha accepted. I saved her grandson from drowning last spring. She feels obligated. And your injury? Tabitha asked, noting again how he seemed to favor one leg. A shadow passed over his face. Not your concern. Tabitha bit back a retort about his rudeness. After all, the man had saved her life. I apologize for the intrusion, she said instead. I know my presence must be an inconvenience. Garrett's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprise at her apology. Eat, he said simply, offering another spoonful. You'll need your strength. As night fell fully outside, the wind rose to a howling fury that rattled the cabin's shutters. Tabitha listened to it with growing unease, realizing how close she had come to dying in that merciless cold. The stew warmed her from within, and gradually the violent trembling in her limbs subsided. "Where will you sleep?" she asked suddenly, realizing she was occupying what appeared to be the cabin's only bed. Garrett gestured toward a pile of furs near the fire. "Slept in worse places." "I can't take your bed, you can and will," he interrupted, his tone allowing no argument. "You nearly died of exposure, you need proper rest." Tabitha wanted to protest further but found herself stifling a yawn instead. The warmth, the food, and the ordeal of the day were catching up with her rapidly. "Rest," Garrett said, his voice softer than before. "We'll figure things out tomorrow." As Tabitha settled back against the rough pillow, she watched through half-lidded eyes as Garrett tended the fire. There was something compelling about him, a contained power in his movements, a watchfulness in his gaze that spoke of hard-won experience. She wondered what had brought him to this solitary existence, what stories lay behind those penetrating eyes. Sleep claimed her before she could ponder further, dragging her down into dreams filled with howling winds and shadowy figures pursuing her through endless snow. Tabitha woke to gray morning light filtering through the cabin's single window. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, but then the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up slowly, relieved to find her body responding more normally, though every muscle ached with protest. Garrett was nowhere to be seen, but evidence of his presence remained. Fresh wood stacked by the fire, a pot of something bubbling gently over the flames, and a cup of water placed within her reach. Outside, the wind still moaned, but with less ferocity than the night before. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, testing her strength. The borrowed clothes hung loosely on her frame, the shirt reaching almost to her knees, the trousers requiring several folds at the ankle to keep from dragging. But they were warm and clean, which was more than could be said for her own garments, which she now spotted hanging near the fire to dry. Using the rough wooden wall for support, Tabitha made her way to the window. What she saw stole her breath away. Snow had fallen heavily overnight, transforming the landscape into an unbroken expanse of white that stretched to distant mountains. The cabin stood in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, their branches heavy with snow. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way and utterly impassable. The realization that she was truly stranded hit her with full force. No one knew where she was. The school board in Silvercreek would simply assume she had changed her mind about the position when she failed to arrive. There would be no search parties, no rescue. The door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and Garrett, his arms laden with firewood. He kicked the door shut behind him and dumped the wood into a box beside the fireplace before turning to her. "Should be in bed," he said by way of greeting. "I'm feeling much better," Tabitha replied, though in truth her legs felt wobbly beneath her. "I needed to see what you're up against," Garrett finished for her, removing his gloves and coat. 3 feet of new snow and more coming. No one's traveling anywhere for a while. How long?" She asked, dreading the answer. He shrugged, moving to check the pot over the fire. "Week, maybe 2, depends on the weather." Tabitha sank onto a nearby chair, her mind racing. 2 weeks trapped in this tiny cabin with a stranger, a man who clearly valued his solitude. The impropriety of the situation would be scandalous in Boston, but out here in the wilderness, such concerns seemed suddenly trivial compared to survival. "I apologize for the burden my presence places on your supplies," she said formally. "I insist on helping however I can to earn my keep." Garrett glanced at her, something like amusement flickering in his eyes. "City manners," he commented. "Not much use out here, Miss Turner." "Tabitha," she corrected, deciding that formality was indeed ridiculous under the circumstances. "And I'm not entirely helpless, Mr. Steele." "I can cook, clean, mend clothing." "Garrett," he reminded her. He ladled something from the pot into a bowl and brought it to her. "Oats, not fancy but filling." Tabitha accepted the bowl gratefully. "Thank you." As she ate, she studied her reluctant host more carefully in the daylight. His beard was neatly trimmed, not wild as many frontiersmen wore theirs. His clothes, though worn, were clean and well maintained. This was not a man who had abandoned civilization entirely, but one who had chosen to live at its edges on his own terms. His injury was more noticeable now as well. When he walked, it was with a slight but distinct limp favoring his right leg. Yet he moved with a certain grace nonetheless, like a predator that had adapted to a limitation without surrendering its essential nature. "Were you in the war?" she asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could consider its propriety. Garrett stilled, his back to her as he stoked the fire. "Yes. My father was too," she offered. "He never spoke of it." "Wise man," Garrett replied, straightening up. "Some things are better left buried." "Is that why you're here, to bury something?" He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You ask a lot of questions for someone whose life I saved." Tabitha felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I apologize. It's a professional hazard, I suppose. Teachers are curious by nature." Something in his face softened slightly. "So you really are a schoolteacher?" "I was," she admitted. "In Boston, the position in Silvercreek would have been my second appointment. Would have been, well, given the circumstances." She gestured vaguely toward the window and the impassable snow beyond. Garrett considered her for a moment. "School term doesn't start until spring. You might make it yet." The casual comment gave Tabitha a strange flutter of hope. Did this taciturn man actually intend to help her reach her destination when the weather cleared? Before she could inquire further, a sharp howl sounded outside, followed by scratching at the door. Garrett moved to open it, and the wolf-like dog Tabitha had glimpsed the night before bounded in, shaking snow from its thick coat. "Shadow," Garrett said by way of introduction. "Half wolf, half who knows what. He comes and goes as he pleases." The animal approached Tabitha cautiously, yellow eyes assessing. She remained perfectly still, unsure whether to be frightened. "He won't hurt you unless I tell him to," Garrett said, which was less reassuring than perhaps he intended. Shadow sniffed at Tabitha's hand, then gave it a single lick before retreating to a spot near the fire, where he circled 3 times before settling down with a contented sigh. "He likes you," Garrett observed, sounding faintly surprised. "He doesn't like most people." "We have that in common," Tabitha replied without thinking. For the first time, she was rewarded with what might almost be called a smile, just a slight upward turn at one corner of Garrett's mouth, but it transformed his face, hinting at a different man beneath the hard exterior. "Rest today," he said, retrieving his coat. "I need to check my traps. Shadow will stay with you." "I'd rather help," Tabitha protested. "I've been in that bed long enough." Garrett assessed her with a critical eye. "You have no proper clothes for this weather. You'd freeze again within minutes." "Then lend me some," she persisted. "I can't simply lie about all day while you work to feed an extra mouth." For a long moment he stared at her as if trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, he nodded once. "Very well. But you'll wear what I give you, and you'll tell me immediately if you start to feel cold." "Deal, deal," Tabitha agreed, relieved to have won this small victory. What followed was a somewhat comical transformation as Garrett outfitted her in layers of his own clothing, wool socks, a second pair of trousers over the first, a heavy flannel shirt, a wool sweater that hung to her knees, and finally, a sheepskin coat that nearly swallowed her whole. He wrapped a woolen scarf around her neck and lower face, leaving only her eyes exposed, then placed a fur-lined hat on her head. "Can you even move?" he asked, stepping back to survey his handiwork. Tabitha took an experimental step, feeling like a child playing dress-up in her father's clothes. "I can manage," she said, her voice muffled by the scarf. Garrett shook his head, but there was that hint of a smile again. "Stubborn woman." Outside, the cold hit Tabitha like a physical blow despite her layers. The snow reached halfway up her borrowed boots, and each step required significant effort. Shadow bounded ahead, disappearing into the trees only to reappear moments later, checking on them. "Stay in my footsteps," Garrett instructed, breaking trail through the deep snow. "Less effort that way." Tabitha did as he suggested, grateful for the path he created. They moved slowly into the forest, the world eerily silent except for the crunch of snow beneath their feet and their labored breathing. "What exactly are we checking?" Tabitha asked after they had walked for perhaps 20 minutes. "Rabbit snares," Garrett replied over his shoulder. Set them yesterday before the worst of the storm. With luck, we'll have fresh meat tonight." The first 2 traps they checked were empty, but the third held a large snowshoe hare, its white fur almost invisible against the snow. Garrett quickly and efficiently dispatched it, then showed Tabitha how to reset the snare. "Your turn at the next one," he said. To her surprise, Tabitha found herself fascinated by the practical knowledge Garrett shared: how to identify animal tracks in the snow, which trees provided the best kindling, how to judge distance and direction when landmarks were obscured by weather. Though his teaching style was terse and matter-of-fact, there was no condescension in it. He simply shared what he knew, expecting her to absorb it. By the time they had checked all 8 traps, yielding 3 rabbits in total, Tabitha was exhausted but exhilarated. Her face tingled from the cold, and her legs burned from the exertion of walking through deep snow, but she felt more alive than she had in months. "You did well," Garrett said as they approached the cabin, the simple praise warming her more effectively than the fire that awaited them inside. "Thank you for allowing me to come," she replied. "I've never experienced anything like this before." He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Most city folk would be complaining by now, not thanking me for the privilege of trudging through snow to collect dead rabbits." Tabitha laughed, the sound startling in the quiet forest. "Perhaps I'm not most city folk." Inside the cabin, they shed their snow-covered outer layers, and Garrett set about preparing the rabbits for cooking. Tabitha insisted on helping, though her skills with a knife were amateur compared to his practiced efficiency. "Did you always live like this?" she asked as they worked side by side at the small table. Garrett was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. "No," he finally said. "Had a ranch once, down near Laramie." "What happened to it?" His hands stilled momentarily. "War happened, then other things." Tabitha sensed the walls going up and didn't press further. Instead, she changed the subject. "How did you meet Mourning Dove?" This proved a safer topic. As they prepared the meal together, Garrett told her about coming across Mourning Dove's grandson, who had fallen through ice while fishing. The boy had nearly drowned, but Garrett had pulled him out and carried him 5 miles to his family's camp, despite his own injured leg slowing him down. "Her people have been here for generations," Garrett explained as he added the rabbit meat to a pot with vegetables. "They know this land better than any white man ever will. Mourning Dove taught me which plants heal, which poison, how to track, how to listen to the forest." "She sounds remarkable," Tabitha said, genuinely impressed. "She is." Garrett hesitated, then added, "Her people have suffered greatly at the hands of men who look like me, yet she judges by actions, not appearance." Tabitha studied him thoughtfully, a valuable lesson for anyone. As they ate the hearty stew that evening, Tabitha found herself watching Garrett covertly. There were layers to this solitary man that intrigued her, moments of unexpected gentleness, contrasting with the hard edges he presented to the world. She wondered what experiences had shaped him, what losses had driven him to this isolated existence. That night, despite Garrett's protests, Tabitha insisted on sleeping on the floor near the fire so he could have his bed back. He finally relented when she pointed out that he was the one who needed to be physically fit to maintain their survival, not her. As she settled into the nest of furs, watching the firelight cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls, Tabitha realized with some surprise that she wasn't afraid anymore, not of the wilderness, not of her uncertain future, and not of the quiet man who slept just a few feet away. Days began to blend together as a routine established itself between them. Mornings were spent tending to necessary chores, collecting firewood, checking traps, melting snow for water. Afternoons often found them inside as the temperature dropped and the short winter day faded. Garrett working on repairs to equipment while Tabitha helped where she could or read from one of the few books she found in the cabin, mostly practical guides to survival and hunting, but also, surprisingly, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. On the 4th day, Tabitha discovered a small stockpile of teaching supplies in her trunk, which Garrett had retrieved from the abandoned stagecoach. Chalk, primers, a geography text, and several novels intended for her older students had survived the ordeal relatively intact. "I could teach you," she offered impulsively that evening as they sat by the fire, Garrett whittling a piece of wood into what appeared to be a chess piece. "If there's anything you'd like to learn," he looked up, eyebrows raised. "What makes you think I need teaching?" "Everyone has something to learn," she replied. "And it would help me practice for my students whenever I finally meet them." Garrett seemed to consider this. "Can you teach math?" The question surprised her. "Of course, arithmetic, algebra, even some geometry." "Show me how to calculate distance using stars," he said. "I know the practical way, but not the mathematical principles." Tabitha's face lit up with enthusiasm. Using the chalk and the blank back pages of one of her books, she began explaining celestial navigation, spherical trigonometry, and the use of sextants. To her delight, Garrett proved an apt pupil, asking incisive questions that revealed a quick mind beneath his taciturn exterior. "You're a natural mathematician," she told him after an hour of instruction. Garrett shrugged, but she could tell he was pleased. "Never had much schooling. Left home at 14, then the war came." "You've educated yourself remarkably well," Tabitha observed. "The books here, your vocabulary, you're no simple mountain man, Garrett Steele." He met her eyes across the table. "And you're no simple schoolmarm, Tabitha Turner. Most women would be hysterical after what you've endured." "Perhaps I haven't had the luxury of hysteria," she replied with a small smile. "When one has no family and little money, one learns to be practical." Something shifted in his gaze, a recognition, perhaps, of a kindred spirit who understood loss and resilience. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken understanding, until shadow whined at the door, breaking the spell. As the days passed, Tabitha began to notice subtle changes in their interactions. Garrett's terseness gradually gave way to more conversation. He shared stories of his travels across the territories, of encounters with wildlife, and whether that would have seemed tall tales had she not already witnessed the extremes of this untamed land. In turn, she told him of Boston, of teaching children from wealthy families who took education for granted, of her dreams to make a difference in a place where learning was valued rather than merely expected. One evening, a week into her unexpected stay, Garrett returned from checking his traps with an unexpected bounty, not just rabbits, but a wild turkey that had wandered into one of his snares. "A feast," Tabitha exclaimed, genuinely excited at the prospect of variety in their diet. "Thought you might be tired of rabbit stew," Garrett said, the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. They worked together to prepare the bird, stuffing it with wild onions and herbs that Morning Dove had provided. As it roasted over the fire, filling the cabin with tantalizing aromas, Garrett surprised Tabitha by producing a dusty bottle from a cupboard. "Saved this for a special occasion," he said, wiping dust from the whiskey bottle. "And what's the occasion?" Tabitha asked, curious. Garrett seemed momentarily at a loss. "1 week of you not dying on my watch," he finally said, but there was a warmth in his eyes that belied the gruffness of his words. Tabitha laughed, accepting the tin cup he offered. "To survival, then." "To good company," Garrett countered softly, touching his cup to hers. The whiskey burned pleasantly down Tabitha's throat, warming her from within. The turkey, when they finally ate it, proved to be the most delicious meal she'd had since leaving Boston. Perhaps it was the hunger of physical labor, or perhaps it was the company, but she couldn't remember enjoying a dinner more. After they'd eaten their fill, Garrett produced the chess set he'd been carving, the pieces rough-hewn but recognizable, the board a square of leather marked with darker stain. "Do you play?" he asked, setting up the pieces. "My father taught me," Tabitha replied, surprised and delighted. "Though I warn you, I'm quite good." Garrett's eyes crinkled at the corners. "We'll see about that." Their first game was closely matched, with Tabitha eventually checkmating Garrett's king after nearly an hour of play. The second game ended in Garrett's victory, his strategy more aggressive than in their first match. "You were holding back before," Tabitha accused good-naturedly as they set up for a third game. "Wanted to see how you played," he admitted. tells a lot about a person, how they approach chess. "And what does my play tell you about me?" she asked, moving her first pawn. Garrett considered both her question and his responding move. "That you're patient, strategic, you see several moves ahead, but you're cautious, sometimes too cautious. You could have won 5 moves earlier if you'd risked your knight." Tabitha blinked, surprised by his insight. "And your play, what does it reveal about the mysterious Garrett Steele?" He moved another piece before answering. "That I've learned when to sacrifice and when to protect. That I value certain pieces above others." His eyes met hers across the board. "That I recognize a worthy opponent when I see one." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something neither was ready to name. Tabitha looked down at the board, her heart beating faster than the game warranted. "Your move," Garrett said softly, and somehow they both knew he wasn't just talking about chess. The storm that had kept them snowbound finally broke the next day, revealing a brilliant blue sky and sun that transformed the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling spectacle of light. Tabitha stood in the doorway of the cabin, breathing deeply of the crisp, clean air. "It's magnificent," she said as Garrett joined her. "Dangerous beauty," he commented. "Still too deep for travel, but we can venture a bit further today. Check the western traps." "I'd like that," Tabitha replied, eager to explore more of the territory surrounding the cabin. They set out after breakfast, Shadow bounding ahead through the snow. The day was still bitterly cold, but the sunshine and lack of wind made it bearable, even pleasant. Tabitha had grown more accustomed to walking in the deep snow, finding a rhythm that conserved energy while making steady progress. As they crested a small ridge, the vista opened before them, a valley stretching toward distant mountains. Untouched white, broken only by the dark green of pine forests and the occasional rocky outcropping. "I've never seen anything so beautiful," Tabitha breathed, momentarily overwhelmed by the majesty of the landscape. "This is why I stay," Garrett said quietly beside her, "despite everything." She turned to look at him, seeing his profile against the brilliant sky. In that moment, with the sun illuminating his features and softening the hard lines around his mouth, she could glimpse the younger man he had once been, before war and hardship had carved their marks upon him. "I understand," she said, and meant it. Though she had known nothing but cities before this journey, something about this wild, untamed land spoke to a part of her she hadn't known existed, a part that craved open spaces and honest challenges rather than the artificial constraints of society. They continued their trek, checking traps and resetting them where necessary. Garrett pointed out tracks in the snow, deer, fox, even a mountain lion that had passed through the area overnight. "Would a mountain lion attack people?" Tabitha asked, scanning the tree line with newfound wariness. "Not usually," Garrett replied. "They prefer to avoid humans, but they're opportunistic hunters. Never turn your back on one." "Comforting," Tabitha said dryly, making him chuckle. The sound of his laughter, rare and unguarded, sent a pleasant warmth through her that had nothing to do with exertion or the layers of clothing she wore. On their return journey, they took a different path that led them past a frozen waterfall, its cascades suspended in time like a massive glass sculpture. Garrett showed Tabitha how to chip away ice to reach the running water beneath, explaining that moving water froze last and thawed first. "Always useful knowledge in these parts," he said as she cupped her hands to drink the frigid, sweet water. "You're a good teacher," she told him, straightening up. He looked momentarily taken aback by the compliment. "Just practical knowledge, the best kind," Tabitha insisted. "The children in Silvercreek will need these skills far more than Latin declensions or European history." "You'll be good for them," Garrett said with unexpected seriousness. "This territory needs teachers who understand that." His faith in her abilities touched Tabitha deeply. "Thank you," she said simply. They walked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of snow beneath their boots and Shadow's occasional snuffling as he investigated interesting scents. "You ever get lonely out here?" Tabitha asked eventually. Garrett didn't answer immediately. "Used to people confuses me with being lonely," he finally said. Most company isn't worth the trouble it brings. Most, she echoed, catching the qualification in his statement. He glanced at her, then away. There are exceptions. Before Tabitha could respond, Shadow suddenly froze, hackles rising as he stared intently into the trees ahead. Garrett's hand went immediately to the rifle slung across his back. "What is it?" Tabitha whispered, instinctively moving closer to him. "Not sure," he murmured, scanning the forest. "Could be anything, elk, bear." Even he broke off as figures emerged from the trees, 3 men on horseback, rifles prominently displayed across their saddles. Tabitha felt Garrett tense beside her, his body shifting slightly to place himself between her and the newcomers. "Well, well," called the foremost rider, a heavy-set man with a filthy beard and small, cruel eyes. "Look what we have here, boys. Steele's got himself a woman." Tabitha's blood ran cold as recognition dawned. These were the same men who had attacked the stagecoach. She recognized the leader's voice, though she hadn't seen his face during the ambush. "Blackburn," Garrett acknowledged, his voice flat and cold. "You're a long way from your usual haunts." "Business brings us this direction," Blackburn replied with a yellow-toothed grin. "Speaking of which, we're missing a passenger from a coach we encountered last week. Thought everyone scattered to the winds, but seems one found shelter instead." His gaze raked over Tabitha with undisguised lust. "Pretty little thing." Shadow growled low in his throat, and Garrett's hand tightened on his rifle, though he hadn't raised it yet. "She's under my protection, Blackburn. Ride on." The outlaw laughed, an ugly sound. "Under your protection, that what they're calling it these days." He leaned forward in his saddle. "How about sharing, Steele? Been a long winter for my boys." "I said ride on," Garrett repeated, and now the rifle was in his hands, not yet aimed but ready. "Next words out of your mouth better be goodbye." Tension crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Tabitha held her breath, acutely aware that they were outnumbered and that the men on horseback had the advantage of mobility in the deep snow. Blackburn's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. Whatever he saw in Garrett's stance or expression must have convinced him that pressing the issue wasn't worth the risk. "Another time, then," he said, his forced joviality not masking the malice beneath. "Weather's breaking. We'll be seeing more of each other, I expect." His gaze shifted to Tabitha. "Both of you." With that, he wheeled his horse around, his companions following suit. They disappeared back into the trees, the sound of hoofbeats fading gradually. Only when they were completely gone did Garrett lower his rifle. "We need to move," he said tersely. "They might circle back." They set off at a much faster pace than before, taking a circuitous route back to the cabin that Tabitha struggled to follow. By the time they reached the clearing, her legs were burning with exertion and her lungs ached from the cold air. Inside, Garrett immediately began checking the shutters and door, reinforcing them with additional wooden bars that had been leaning against the wall. "Who were they?" Tabitha asked, still shaken by the encounter. "Wade Blackburn and his gang," Garrett replied grimly. "Robbers, murderers. They operate mainly around the stagecoach routes between Cheyenne and Fort Laramie, but they've been pushing further north lately." "They're the ones who attacked my coach," Tabitha said. I recognized his voice. Garrett paused in his preparations to look at her. "You're lucky to be alive, then." "Blackburn doesn't usually leave witnesses." "That's what you said when you found me," she recalled. "You knew it was them all along." "Suspected," he corrected. "Recognized the pattern, now I know for sure." He resumed his work, checking the ammunition for his rifle and a revolver he retrieved from a trunk. "Will they come here?" Tabitha asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice. Garrett considered the question. "Not today. Snow's still too deep for a direct assault, and they know I'm armed." He met her eyes directly. "But yes, eventually. Blackburn doesn't like being defied, and he's taken an interest in you." The blunt assessment sent a chill through Tabitha that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What will we do?" "We'll be ready," Garrett said simply. "And when the snow melts enough, we'll head for Silvercreek. You'll be safer there." "We," Tabitha caught the pronoun immediately. Garrett nodded once decisively. "I'll take you there myself. Can't in good conscience send you off alone with Blackburn's gang roaming these parts." Relief flooded through Tabitha, followed quickly by concern of a different sort. But your home, you'd leave it undefended. Nothing here worth dying for, he said with a shrug. Just things. Can always rebuild if necessary. The casual courage of his statement moved Tabitha deeply. This man, who valued his solitude so highly, was willing to abandon his home to ensure her safety. Thank you, she said inadequately, wishing she had better words to express her gratitude. Garrett merely nodded, returning to his preparations. But later that evening, as they sat by the fire after a tense day of watching and waiting, he spoke again of Blackburn. Met him first during the war, he explained, his voice low and reflective. He was a camp follower, not a soldier, but one of those vultures who profited from others' misery. Selling inferior supplies, running crooked card games, peddling rot-gut whiskey that blinded more than one good man. And after the war, Tabitha prompted when he fell silent, after he found that lawlessness suited him. Gathered like-minded men, started small with petty theft, worked up to stagecoaches and eventually banks. Garrett stared into the fire. I encountered him again 3 years ago when I still had my ranch. He and his men stole half my horses, killed 2 of my hands. Is that how you were injured? Tabitha asked gently. Garrett's hand unconsciously moved to his right thigh. Yes, took a bullet trying to stop them, nearly died from infection afterward. I'm sorry, Tabitha said, understanding now some of the shadows that haunted him. Sheriff couldn't do anything or wouldn't. Blackburn pays well for protection in certain quarters. Bitterness edged his voice. After I recovered, I sold what was left of the ranch and came north. Thought I'd left him behind, and now he's followed, Tabitha concluded. Because of me. Garrett's eyes lifted to meet hers. Not your fault. Blackburn goes where opportunity leads, always has. Still, I've brought danger to your door. Danger was already there, he replied with a slight shrug, just wearing a different face. As they prepared for sleep that night, the atmosphere in the cabin was charged with a new tension. Garrett insisted on taking the first watch, positioned near the window where he could observe the approach to the cabin. Tabitha tried to sleep on the cot but found rest elusive, her mind replaying the encounter in the forest and imagining worse scenarios. After an hour of tossing restlessly, she rose and joined Garrett at his post. Can't sleep? He asked without turning from the window. No, she settled beside him on the bench. Too many thoughts, understandable. They sat in silence for a while, watching the moonlight cast blue shadows across the snow. The night was perfectly still, the storm long past, stars glittering coldly in the clear sky. It's strange, Tabitha finally said. A week ago I was terrified of this wilderness. Now it feels almost like home. Garrett glanced at her, his expression softened by the dim light. Nature has a way of changing perspectives. It's not just nature, she admitted quietly. It's you too, your knowledge, your patience. You've shown me a different way of seeing the world. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. You're a quick study. I mean it, Garrett, Tabitha persisted, suddenly needing him to understand. When I was lost in that storm, I thought my life was over. Instead, I found something I didn't know I was looking for. The words hung between them, laden with implications neither was quite ready to voice. Garrett's gaze held hers for a long moment before he looked away, back to the window. Try to rest, he said, his voice rougher than before. I'll wake you for your watch in a few hours. Tabitha recognized the deflection but didn't push further. She returned to the cot, and this time sleep came more easily, as if having spoken some of her feelings aloud had quieted the tumult within. She woke to Garrett's hand on her shoulder, his touch light but insistent. Your turn, he murmured. Dawn in about 3 hours. Wake me then if all's quiet. Tabitha nodded, still half asleep, and took his place at the window. The night remained peaceful, the only movement the occasional drift of snow from an overloaded branch. As promised, she woke Garrett at first light, touching his shoulder as he had touched hers. He came awake instantly, fully alert, the habit, she supposed, of a man accustomed to danger. For a brief moment, as sleep fell away from his features, she glimpsed vulnerability in his expression that he quickly masked. All quiet? He asked, sitting up. Yes, Tabitha confirmed. Not even shadow stirred. Garrett nodded, rising to add wood to the dying fire. Good, but we stay vigilant. Blackburn's not one to make idle threats. The next few days established a new pattern. One of them always kept watch while the other slept or tended to necessary chores. They ventured outside only together and only briefly enough to gather firewood, check the closest traps, or allow Shadow to patrol the perimeter of the clearing. Despite the underlying tension, Tabitha found these days oddly peaceful. Confined to the cabin's small space, she and Garrett developed a deeper understanding of each other through conversation and shared activities. He taught her to whittle, guiding her hands with calloused fingers that were surprisingly gentle. She shared stories from her favorite books, bringing characters to life with animated retellings that sometimes coaxed rare smiles from him. In the evenings, they continued their chess matches, each learning the other's strategies and adapting accordingly. Tabitha found herself looking forward to these games, to the intellectual challenge and the quiet companionship they provided. On the fifth night after their encounter with Blackburn, as a light snow fell outside, Garrett suddenly asked, "Why teaching?" Tabitha looked up from the chessboard, surprised by the question. "Why not? Most women your age and education would be seeking a husband, not a position in a frontier town," he observed. "I was engaged once," Tabitha admitted, moving her bishop, "to a banker's son in Boston, Alexander. He seemed perfect, educated, well-mannered, from a good family." She smiled ruefully. "He also helped himself to my modest inheritance while my father was dying, then disappeared when the money was gone." Garrett's expression darkened. "Bastard, indeed," Tabitha agreed. "But in a way he did me a favor. Without him I might never have discovered my love for teaching, or found the courage to come west." She looked directly at Garrett. "Or met you." The firelight caught golden highlights in her hair and softened her features, making her look younger, more vulnerable. Garrett seemed momentarily transfixed, his next chess move forgotten. "Your turn," Tabitha reminded him gently. He blinked, then moved a piece almost at random. "You're not what I expected, Tabitha Turner." "What did you expect when I found you half frozen in that storm?" he shrugged. "Someone weaker, someone who'd complain about the hardships, who'd fall apart when faced with men like Blackburn." "I'm not saying I wasn't terrified," Tabitha admitted. Still am a little, but fear doesn't help survive." "No," Garrett agreed softly. "It doesn't." He hesitated, then added, "My wife couldn't adapt to this life." The casual mention of a wife, the first Tabitha had heard of such, startled her. "You were married," Garrett nodded, his expression distant. "Briefly. After the war, Sarah was a doctor's daughter from Philadelphia. Thought she wanted adventure, a life in the West." His mouth twisted. Reality proved different from her romantic notions. "What happened?" Tabitha asked, sensing there was more to the story. "She left, went back east." The flat statement held volumes of unspoken pain. "Can't blame her. This life isn't for everyone." "I'm sorry," Tabitha said, meaning it. The revelation explained some of his wariness, his reluctance to form attachments. "Long time ago," Garrett replied with a dismissive gesture. "Different man, different life." But Tabitha could see it wasn't so simple, that the wounds of abandonment still influenced his choices, his isolation. In that moment, she felt a deeper connection to him, recognizing that they had both been shaped by betrayal, both learned to guard their hearts. "Checkmate," she said quietly, moving her queen into position. Garrett stared at the board, then laughed softly. "Distracted me with your story." "Tactical advantage," Tabitha replied with a small smile. "You taught me that." His eyes met hers across the table, warm with something that made her breath catch. "So I did." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibilities. Tabitha found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by some invisible force. Garrett's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, a question in his expression. The moment was shattered by Shadow's sudden bark outside, sharp, urgent, a warning. Garrett was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, all softness gone from his demeanor. "Stay away from the windows," he instructed, moving to douse the lantern that would make them visible from outside. In the sudden darkness, Tabitha's heart pounded as she listened intently. At first, she heard nothing beyond Shadow's continued barking. Then came the sound of voices, distant but approaching, multiple men. Blackburn, she whispered. Likely, Garrett confirmed grimly. 3, maybe 4 by the sound. What do we do? We're prepared. He handed her the revolver she'd seen earlier. Know how to use this. Tabitha shook her head, fear tightening her throat. Simple, Garrett said, quickly showing her the basics. Point and pull the trigger. 6 shots. Use them only if someone comes through that door who isn't me. Where will you be? Alarm colored her voice. Creating a distraction, he replied, checking his rifle one last time. When I fire, they'll focus on me. That gives you time if needed. Garrett, no, Tabitha began, but he cut her off. No arguments. Stay here, bar the door behind me. His hand touched her cheek briefly in the darkness, a fleeting caress. Trust me. Before she could protest further, he was gone, slipping out the door with Shadow at his heels. Tabitha's hands shook as she slid the heavy wooden bar into place, the revolver cold and foreign in her grip. The next minutes stretched into an eternity of strained listening. The voices outside grew louder, then suddenly silent. A shot rang out Garrett's rifle, she thought, followed by shouts and a volley of return fire. Tabitha flinched with each report, imagining bullets finding their mark in Garrett's body, imagining him falling in the snow as he had once found her. More shots, more shouting. A man's scream of pain. Shadows snarling, vicious and feral, then an ominous silence. Tabitha stood frozen by the door, the revolver raised, her entire body trembling with fear and adrenaline. When knocking came, she nearly screamed. Tabitha, Garrett's voice strained but alive. It's me, open up. She fumbled with the bar, relief making her clumsy, and pulled the door open. Garrett stumbled in, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. Shadow limped in behind him, favoring his right front paw. Are you hurt anywhere else? Tabitha demanded, helping him to a chair. Just the head, Garrett replied, grimacing as she examined the wound. Blackburn's gone. One of his men won't be causing any more trouble. The others dragged him off. You killed one of them? Tabitha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Garrett's eyes met hers, steady and unapologetic. It was him or me, and you. Tabitha nodded, understanding the harsh reality of their situation. She retrieved clean cloths and water, then set about cleaning the wound on his forehead. The cut was deep but not life-threatening. As she worked, her hands steadied, focused on the task. You handle blood well, Garrett observed, watching her face. My father's illness taught me that much, at least, she replied. Hold still. When she had finished bandaging his head, Tabitha turned her attention to Shadow, examining his injured paw with gentle hands. The wolf dog allowed her ministrations with surprising patience. Just bruised, I think, she concluded. No broken bones that I can feel. Garrett nodded, relief evident in his expression. He saved my life out there, took down one of Blackburn's men when I was cornered. Good boy, Tabitha murmured, scratching behind Shadow's ears. The animal leaned into her touch, his yellow eyes half closed in contentment despite his injury. Blackburn will be back, Garrett said after a moment. With more men next time, then we should leave, Tabitha suggested. Head for Silvercreek as you said, Garrett nodded slowly. Snow's melted enough on the southern slopes. If we leave at first light, travel light, we might make it in 3 days. 3 days, Tabitha echoed, surprised. I thought it was 30 miles, as the crow flies, Garrett confirmed. But we'll need to take routes that offer cover, avoid open spaces where we'd be visible. That means following creeks, staying in forests when possible. The pragmatic discussion of their escape plan helped calm Tabitha's still racing heart. This was something tangible, something they could prepare for rather than simply waiting for the next attack. They spent the remainder of the night gathering only the most essential supplies: food, water, ammunition, minimal clothing, and blankets. Everything had to fit in 2 packs they could carry, plus what Shadow could manage in small saddlebags Garrett fashioned for him. As dawn approached, Tabitha found herself looking around the small cabin with an unexpected sense of loss. In just over 2 weeks, this place had become more than shelter, it had become a kind of home, the setting for a transformation she was only beginning to understand. We'll come back, Garrett said quietly, reading her expression, when it's safe. The simple statement not I, sent a flutter through Tabitha's chest. Promise, Garrett met her eyes across the cabin. Promise. They departed as the first pale light of dawn crept over the eastern mountains. The air was bitingly cold but still, no wind to carry their scent or the sound of their passage. Shadow led the way, his injured paw seemingly forgotten as he ranged ahead, then back, checking their progress. Garrett set a pace that challenged Tabitha's endurance but remained within her capabilities. They spoke little, conserving breath and maintaining awareness of their surroundings. When they did stop to rest, it was briefly and in places that offered natural concealment beneath overhanging rocks or within dense stands of pine. By midday, they had covered nearly 8 miles, descending steadily from the higher elevations where Garrett's cabin stood. The snow thinned as they lost altitude, making travel easier but also leaving more visible tracks. Garrett led them into a shallow creek, the icy water numbing Tabitha's feet through her boots as they walked within its course for nearly a mile. "Covers our trail," he explained when they finally emerged onto a rocky bank. "Water's too cold for most trackers to follow for long." Tabitha nodded, not trusting herself to speak through chattering teeth. Garrett noticed her distress and called for a longer rest, building a small, nearly smokeless fire using techniques he'd learned from Mourning Dove's people. The tiny flames provided just enough heat to warm their hands and dry their sodden boots. "You're doing well," Garrett told her as they shared jerked venison and hard biscuits. "Better than most experienced travelers would." "High praise from Garrett Steele," Tabitha replied with a small smile, warmed as much by his words as by the fire. "Deserved," he said simply. They continued their journey through the afternoon, the terrain gradually changing from forest to more open country rolling hills dotted with stands of aspen and cottonwood. Garrett grew more vigilant in these exposed areas, frequently stopping to scan the horizon with a small brass spyglass. As dusk approached, he led them to a cluster of massive boulders that formed a natural shelter on one side, protected from the prevailing wind and obscured from casual observation. "We'll rest here tonight," he decided. Too dangerous to travel after dark in unfamiliar territory. They made camp with practiced efficiency, working together without needing to speak. Garrett constructed another small fire while Tabitha arranged their bedrolls close to the heat source. Shadow settled at the perimeter of their camp, his keen senses their first line of defense against intruders. After a simple meal, they sat side by side, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. The vastness of the heavens seemed especially profound here, away from trees that had previously limited their view at the cabin. "When I was a child," Tabitha said softly, "my father told me that stars were holes in the floor of heaven, letting light shine through." Garrett smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his features. "I like that image. What about you?" she asked. "What did you believe about stars as a boy?" He was quiet for a moment, and Tabitha thought he might not answer. These glimpses into his past were rare and precious. But then he spoke, his voice low and reflective. "My grandfather was a sailor. He taught me the constellations, how to navigate by them." Garrett pointed upward. "That's Polaris, the North Star. No matter where you are, no matter how lost, it shows you the way home." The simple statement held unexpected emotion, revealing a glimpse of the boy he had been, learning at his grandfather's knee. Tabitha found herself wondering about that boy, what dreams he had harbored, what paths he had imagined for himself before war and hardship intervened. "Did you always want to be a rancher?" she asked. Garrett shook his head. "Wanted to be a shipbuilder like my grandfather, but the war came, and after," he shrugged. "Seemed easier to head west, start fresh where no one knew me. And now, what do you want now?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the simple words. Garrett turned to look at her, firelight highlighting the planes of his face, the intensity in his eyes. "Beginning to remember what wanting feels like," he said quietly. Tabitha's breath caught at the naked honesty in his voice, the vulnerability he allowed her to see. Slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, she reached out and covered his hand with hers. "I know what you mean," she whispered. His fingers entwined with hers, rough calluses against her softer skin. For long moments they sat thus, connected by that simple touch, while around them the wilderness settled into night and stars wheeled overhead, marking the passage of time in their ancient, patient way. Morning came cold and clear, frost rime their blankets and stiffening the leather of their boots. They ate quickly, packed efficiently, and were moving again before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills. The second day of travel proved more challenging than the first. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, with steep ravines requiring careful navigation. By midday, Tabitha's muscles burned with exertion, but she pressed on without complaint, determined not to slow their progress. They stopped briefly near a small spring to refill their water containers. As Tabitha knelt by the clear pool, she caught sight of her reflection and barely recognized herself. The prim schoolteacher from Boston was gone, replaced by a woman with wind-burned cheeks, tangled hair, and eyes that held a new confidence. She had changed inside and out in ways that went beyond the physical hardships she had endured. "What do you see?" Garrett asked, noticing her contemplation. "Someone different," Tabitha replied honestly, "someone stronger." Garrett crouched beside her, his own reflection joining hers in the still water. "You were always strong," he said, "just didn't know it yet." The simple faith in his words touched something deep within her. Before she could respond, however, Shadow growled low in his throat, ears pricked toward the ridge above them. Garrett was instantly alert, rifle ready. "Move," he whispered, guiding Tabitha behind a large boulder. They waited in tense silence as Shadow continued to stare intently upward. After a minute that felt like an hour, a mountain goat appeared on the ridge, picking its way delicately across the rocks. The animal paused, sensing their presence, then bounded away with impressive agility. Garrett exhaled slowly, lowering his rifle. "Just a goat." "This time," Tabitha said, her heart still racing. "This time," he agreed grimly. "We need to keep moving, cover as much ground as possible before nightfall." They pressed on through the afternoon, maintaining a punishing pace that left little breath for conversation. By the time Garrett finally called a halt for the night, Tabitha was stumbling with exhaustion, her legs trembling with the effort of remaining upright. They made camp in a small cave, little more than an indentation in a rocky hillside, but providing better shelter than they'd had the previous night. The entrance was partially concealed by brush, offering some protection from both weather and unwanted eyes. Garrett insisted on examining Tabitha's feet when he noticed her wincing as she removed her boots. Blisters had formed and broken, leaving raw, painful spots on her heels and toes. "Should have said something sooner," he chided gently, cleaning the abrasions with water from their canteen. "Didn't want to slow us down," Tabitha admitted. Garrett's expression softened. "Your well-being matters more than speed." From his pack, he produced a small tin of salve, another of Mourning Dove's remedies, and applied it carefully to the worst spots before wrapping her feet in strips of clean cloth. His touch was gentle, his calloused hands incongruously tender as they ministered to her injuries. Tabitha watched his bent head, the concentration in his expression, and felt a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice not entirely steady. Garrett looked up, his hands still cradling her foot. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing since that first night when he had found her in the snow. Slowly, deliberately, he raised one hand to touch her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone with exquisite gentleness. Tabitha leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "Tabitha," he said, her name a question and an answer both. She placed her hand over his, holding it against her cheek. "Yes," she whispered, though he hadn't spoken a question aloud. Garrett moved closer, hesitant despite her encouragement, as if still expecting rejection. When their lips finally met, the contact was feather-light, a tentative exploration rather than a claiming. Tabitha responded with equal gentleness, allowing him to set the pace of this new discovery. The kiss deepened gradually, gaining confidence as mutual desire overcame lingering doubts. His hand slid to the nape of her neck, fingers threading through her hair, while hers gripped the front of his shirt, drawing him closer. When they finally parted, both were breathing unevenly. Garrett rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if memorizing the moment. "Been wanting to do that since I found you cursing at the snow," he admitted, a smile in his voice. Tabitha laughed softly. "I was not cursing. We're two," he countered. Most unladylike language I'd heard in years. "Well, it was a trying situation," she defended, enjoying this playful side of him she'd rarely glimpsed before. Garrett's expression grew more serious as he traced the line of her jaw with one finger. "You're remarkable, Tabitha Turner. Brave and stubborn and beautiful." The compliments brought warmth to her cheeks. "As are you, Garrett Steele, though perhaps stubborn should come first on your list of attributes," he chuckled, the sound rumbling in his chest. "Fair assessment." They ate their evening meal sitting closer than necessary, exchanging occasional touches, as if reassuring themselves that this new development was real. Shadow watched them with what Tabitha fancied was amused tolerance, his yellow eyes following their interactions before he finally sighed heavily and settled down to sleep. "We should rest," Garrett said eventually, though reluctance colored his tone. "Long day tomorrow if we're to reach Silvercreek by nightfall." Tabitha nodded, suddenly acutely aware of the implications. Silvercreek meant civilization, other people, social norms that would not allow the freedom they had found in the wilderness. It meant her teaching position, the reason for her journey west in the first place. And for Garrett, it meant. What, would he simply deliver her safely and return to his solitary existence? "What happens when we reach town?" she asked, voicing the concern aloud. Garrett considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "That depends," he finally said, On what you want." His eyes held her steadily. "On what we both want." Tabitha took a deep breath. "I want you," she said simply. "I didn't expect to find you, Garrett Steele, but now that I have, I don't want to lose you." The naked honesty in her declaration seemed to touch something deep within him. He cupped her face in both hands, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "Then you won't lose me," he promised. "We'll figure out the rest." The vow, straightforward and unembellished, was quintessentially Garrett, no flowery protestations, just a simple truth spoken plainly. It meant more to Tabitha than any poetic declaration could have. They slept that night wrapped in each other's arms, sharing warmth and the newfound intimacy of acknowledged feelings. Despite the hard ground beneath them and the lingering threat of pursuit, Tabitha couldn't remember ever feeling so secure, so perfectly at peace. The final day of their journey dawned crisp and bright. They set out early, moving with renewed purpose toward Silvercreek. By mid-morning they could see smoke from chimneys in the distance, the first sign of civilization Tabitha had glimpsed since the ill-fated stagecoach journey. "There it is," Garrett said, pointing to a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley perhaps 5 miles distant. "Silvercreek." Tabitha felt a curious mixture of emotions: relief at reaching their destination safely, anticipation of beginning her new position, and a thread of apprehension about how her relationship with Garrett would adapt to town life. "It's smaller than I expected," she observed. "Most things out here are," Garrett replied with a slight smile, "except the sky and the distances." They continued their descent toward the town, following a winding path that eventually joined a more established trail. As they drew closer, details became visible: a church steeple, a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, corrals on the outskirts where horses grazed. "The school is on the north edge of town," Garrett told her. "Small building with a bell tower, teachers' quarters attached to the back." "You know it well?" Tabitha asked, surprised by his familiarity with the layout. "Helped build it 3 years ago," he admitted. "Before I moved further into the mountains." "You never mentioned that," Tabitha said, giving him a questioning look. Garrett shrugged. "Didn't seem relevant at first." "Later, well," he glanced at her. "Wasn't sure how I felt about delivering you to the position." The confession warmed her despite the chill in the air. "Selfish, Mr. Steele," she teased gently. "Very," he agreed without a trace of remorse. As they approached the outskirts of town, Garrett grew more vigilant, scanning the surroundings with careful attention. "Blackburn has associates in most settlements," he explained. "Eyes and ears that report back to him. Once we're in town, we should assume we're being watched. The warning sobered Tabitha immediately. What's our plan? Get you settled at the school, then I'll speak with Sheriff Ellis. He's a good man, not on Blackburn's payroll. He'll want to know about the stagecoach robbery and the attack at my cabin. And after that, Tabitha pressed. Garrett's expression softened as he looked at her. After that, I thought I might see if the schoolteacher needs any repairs done to her quarters. I hear the roof leaks when it rains. The simple statement of intent, his way of saying he intended to stay near her, relieved Tabitha's anxiety considerably. I've heard that as well, she replied, playing along, and the windows are drafty. Could take weeks to fix properly, Garrett mused, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half smile. Months even, Tabitha suggested, returning his smile. Their light-hearted exchange was interrupted by Shadow's sudden alertness, his head raised as he scented the air. Before Garrett could react, riders appeared from behind a stand of trees ahead, 4 men, Blackburn prominent among them. Well, well, the outlaw called, his voice carrying across the open ground between them. Thought you might head for town eventually, decided to welcome you properly. Garrett pushed Tabitha behind him, his rifle already in his hands. That's close enough, Blackburn. The outlaw reined his horse to a stop perhaps 30 yards away, his men spreading out to flank him. No need for hostilities, Steele, just want the woman. You can walk away, forget you ever saw her. Not happening, Garrett replied, his voice cold and flat. Blackburn sighed theatrically. Stubborn as always. Fine then, we'll take her anyway, and you can die knowing you failed to protect her. Tabitha's heart pounded in her chest, but fear was gradually giving way to anger. She was tired of being discussed as if she were property to be claimed rather than a person with her own will. I am not something to be taken, Mr. Blackburn, she called, stepping out from behind Garrett despite his attempt to keep her sheltered. And Mr. Steele doesn't speak for me, I speak for myself. Her boldness seemed to amuse the outlaw. Feisty little thing, aren't you? Even better. The spirited ones are more entertaining. His lewd implication made Tabitha's skin crawl, but she stood her ground. The only place I'm going is Silvercreek to take up my position as teacher. If you or your men interfere with that, you'll answer to the law. Blackburn laughed outright. The law. Out here, honey, I am the law in these parts. Not in Silvercreek, Garrett countered. Sheriff Ellis might have something to say about that. A flash of annoyance crossed Blackburn's face at the mention of the sheriff. Ellis is one man, and he's not here now. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, neither side willing to back down. Tabitha could feel Garrett's tension beside her, knew he was calculating odds and possibilities. 4 against 1 were poor odds, even with Shadow's assistance. Then, unexpectedly, salvation appeared from an unexpected quarter. The sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention to the ridge behind them. 3 riders appeared, rifles ready, and in the lead, wearing a silver star on his chest, was a man Tabitha assumed must be Sheriff Ellis. That's far enough, Blackburn, the sheriff called, his voice carrying the weight of authority. You're on Silvercreek territory now. The outlaw's face darkened with fury, but he clearly recognized when the advantage had shifted. Just having a friendly conversation, Sheriff, he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Doesn't look friendly from where I'm standing, Ellis replied dryly. Now, you and your boys turn around and ride back the way you came. Don't stop until you've crossed the county line. For a moment, it seemed Blackburn might challenge the order. His hand hovered near his pistol and his men looked to him for direction. But finally, with a curse, he wheeled his horse around. This isn't over, Steele, he called over his shoulder as they departed, not by a long shot. Only when the outlaws had disappeared from sight did Sheriff Ellis approach, dismounting to greet them properly. Garrett Steele, he said, extending his hand. Been a while. Tom, Garrett acknowledged, shaking the offered hand. Good timing. Morning Dove's boy came to town yesterday, said you might be heading our way with trouble on your tail. The sheriff turned his attention to Tabitha. And you must be Miss Turner. School board's been worried sick when you didn't arrive on schedule. There were complications, Tabitha explained, somewhat overwhelmed by this sudden introduction to civilization after weeks in the wilderness. Ellis nodded understandingly. So I gather. Why don't we get you both into town, get you settled, and then you can tell me the whole story?" The sheriff and his deputies escorted them the remaining distance to Silvercreek, a gesture of protection that Tabitha appreciated even as she marveled at the suddenness of the transition. After the isolation of Garrett's cabin and the wilderness journey, the small frontier town seemed bustling and overwhelmingly social. People emerged from buildings to watch their passage, curious about the new arrivals. Tabitha was acutely aware of her appearance, her borrowed men's clothing, her tangled hair, the evidence of hard travel written in every line of her body. Not the dignified entrance she had envisioned when accepting the teaching position. True to Garrett's description, the schoolhouse stood at the north end of town, a simple but well-constructed building with a small bell tower and attached living quarters. Sheriff Ellis left one deputy to stand guard while he escorted Tabitha and Garrett inside to inspect what would be her new home. The teachers' quarters were modest but clean, a combined sitting room and kitchen, a small bedroom, and a tiny study lined with bookshelves. Previous occupants had left basic furnishings, and someone had recently stocked the pantry with staples and lit a fire in the small stove, warming the space in anticipation of her arrival. "School board asked Mrs. Hollister to prepare the place when we heard you might be coming today," Ellis explained. "She'll be by later with some proper clothes, I expect. The women of Silvercreek are eager to welcome you." "That's very kind," Tabitha said, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness of people she had yet to meet. While she explored her new home, Sheriff Ellis drew Garrett aside for a quiet conversation. Tabitha couldn't hear their words, but the grave expressions on both men's faces told her they were discussing Blackburn and the threat he posed. When the sheriff finally departed, promising to return later for their full statements, Tabitha and Garrett found themselves alone for the first time since entering town. Shadow had been left outside, reluctant to enter the confines of the building but maintaining a watchful presence nearby. "So," Garrett said, looking around the small quarters, "what do you think?" "It's perfect," Tabitha replied honestly. After the primitive conditions of the cabin, the modest rooms seemed luxurious, a real stove, glass windows, actual furniture, though I notice the roof does appear to need work. Garrett's mouth quirked in a smile at her reference to their earlier conversation. "Definitely, and those windows won't keep out the winter drafts." "Extensive repairs needed, clearly," Tabitha agreed, stepping closer to him. "Might take a very long time." "Might," Garrett concurred, his voice dropping lower as his arms encircled her waist. "If the teacher is patient, she can be," Tabitha assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him lightly. "Very patient for the right craftsman." The sound of approaching footsteps outside reminded them of their public setting. They separated reluctantly, assuming more proper positions before a knock came at the door. The next hours passed in a whirlwind of introductions and arrangements. Mrs. Hollister, a motherly woman who served as the unofficial welcoming committee for Silvercreek, arrived with clothing, food, and a torrent of information about the town and its inhabitants. The chairman of the school board made an appearance, expressing relief at Tabitha's safe arrival and outlining expectations for the spring term. Through it all, Garrett remained a steady presence, quietly supportive but allowing Tabitha to establish herself with her new neighbors. She appreciated his understanding of how important this was to her, that while her feelings for him had transformed her journey, her purpose in coming west remained meaningful. As evening approached, the stream of visitors finally ebbed. Sheriff Ellis returned as promised, taking their statements about the stagecoach robbery and subsequent events. His expression grew increasingly grave as they related their encounters with Blackburn. "Man's getting bolder," the sheriff observed when they had finished. "Used to stay clear of established towns, stick to the trails and isolated homesteads. Now he's pushing boundaries, testing how far he can go." "He won't stop," Garrett said flatly, "not until he gets what he wants. Or until someone stops him permanently," Ellis added, his meaning clear. "I've sent telegrams to the territorial marshals. With your testimonies, we might finally have enough to put together a proper pursuit. Until then," Tabitha asked, concerned about the immediate threat. Until then, we stay vigilant, the sheriff replied. I'll keep a deputy nearby, and I suggest you both remain in town, where there are plenty of eyes and guns to discourage trouble. After Ellis departed, promising to return in the morning with any news from the marshals, Tabitha began preparing a simple supper from the provisions Mrs. Hollister had brought. Garrett watched her move about the small kitchen, a thoughtful expression on his face. "What is it?" she asked, noticing his contemplation. "Trying to picture it," he admitted. "You here, teaching the children, becoming part of this community." "And yourself," Tabitha prompted. "Where do you fit in this picture?" Garrett moved to join her by the stove, his proximity sending a pleasant warmth through her that had nothing to do with the cooking fire. "That depends," he said, echoing his words from their fireside conversation in the cave. "On what?" Tabitha asked, though she thought she knew the answer. Garrett took her hands in his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "On whether you could see yourself loving a man who spent years running from his past, a man who's not entirely sure he remembers how to live among people." The simple honesty of his question moved Tabitha deeply. "I already do love that man," she said softly. "I have for some time now." Something like wonder crossed Garrett's face at her declaration, even knowing the danger that follows him, the scars he carries. "Especially knowing those things," Tabitha assured him. "They're part of who you are, Garrett, the man who found me in a snowstorm and said she belongs to me when Blackburn tried to claim me." Garrett's eyebrows rose slightly. "I said that, you did," Tabitha confirmed with a small smile. "Rather possessively, I might add. Wasn't trying to claim ownership," he clarified, looking somewhat abashed. "Just making it clear you were under my protection." "I know," Tabitha said, squeezing his hands. "And while I'm perfectly capable of speaking for myself, as I demonstrated today, I rather liked knowing you considered me worth protecting." She looked up at him earnestly. "Just as I consider you worth loving, worth building a future with if that's what you want." Garrett's answer came not in words but in actions. He drew her into his arms and kissed her with an intensity that left no doubt of his feelings, his hands cradling her face as if she were something infinitely precious. "I love you, Tabitha Turner," he said when they finally parted, his voice rough with emotion. "Have since you stood in my cabin and insisted on checking traps in 3 feet of snow rather than being a burden." Tabitha laughed softly at the memory. Not the most romantic moment to fall in love. "Spoke volumes about who you are," Garrett countered. "Your strength, your determination, your willingness to adapt rather than complain." His thumb traced the curve of her cheek. "Made me start to hope again after years of not bothering." The admission, so simple yet so profound, touched Tabitha to her core. She knew what it cost this private man to speak so openly of his feelings, to make himself vulnerable after years of self-imposed isolation. "Then stay," she said simply. "Help me make this place a home. We'll face whatever comes together." "Together," Garrett agreed, sealing the promise with another kiss. Blackburn's threat remained, hovering at the edges of their newfound happiness. But as days passed with no sign of the outlaw or his men, life in Silvercreek began to establish its own rhythm. True to his word, Garrett set about repairing the teachers' quarters, extending and improving them with skilled hands. Word of his carpentry abilities spread quickly, and soon he had offers of other work from townsfolk eager to employ his talents. To Tabitha's delight, he accepted these commissions, gradually reintegrating into the community he had once helped build. Shadow, initially regarded with suspicion by the townspeople, earned their acceptance after preventing a young child from wandering into the creek during spring melt. The wolf dog became a familiar sight around the schoolhouse, often accompanying the children during their outdoor lessons. The school term began with 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 16, a diverse group that challenged all of Tabitha's teaching skills. She found herself adapting her Boston education methods to the practical needs of frontier children, incorporating lessons on local plants, animal tracking, and weather prediction alongside reading and arithmetic. To her surprise and pleasure, Garrett occasionally joined these practical lessons, sharing his knowledge of the land with a patience that made him a natural teacher. The children, especially the boys, regarded him with something approaching hero worship, captivated by his quiet confidence and wilderness skills. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire in their increasingly comfortable home, sharing the events of their day. These quiet moments, Tabitha grading papers or preparing lessons while Garrett whittled or repaired equipment. Shadow dozing at their feet became the foundation of a contentment neither had expected to find. Spring advanced into early summer, bringing wildflowers to the meadows around Silvercreek and longer, warmer days. News arrived that territorial marshals had engaged Blackburn's gang near the Colorado border, killing 2 of his men and wounding others, though Blackburn himself had escaped. "He'll lie low for a while," Sheriff Ellis predicted when he brought this news. "Lick his wounds, recruit new men, might be months before he causes trouble again. Or he might decide revenge is worth the risk," Garrett countered, his arm protectively around Tabitha's shoulders. "Either way, we're prepared," Ellis assured them. "Town's watching out for its own now." The sheriff's words proved prophetic in ways none of them anticipated. One bright June morning, as Tabitha was conducting lessons in the schoolyard, taking advantage of the beautiful weather, a lone rider appeared on the road from the east. The man was barely recognizable, thinner, haggard, his once imposing presence diminished by injury and hardship. But the cold eyes that fixed on Tabitha were unmistakably Blackburn's. Before she could react, Shadow was between her and the approaching threat, hackles raised, a growl rumbling from deep in his chest. The children, sensing danger, clustered behind Tabitha as she stood her ground. "Get the sheriff," she instructed the oldest boy quietly, "and find Mr. Steele, quickly now." As the boy slipped away, Tabitha faced Blackburn with outward calm that belied her racing heart. "This is a school, Mr. Blackburn. You have no business here." The outlaw's laugh was a hollow echo of his former bravado. "Just wanted to see for myself," he said, his voice raspy. "The woman worth dying for." "No one is dying today," Tabitha replied firmly. Blackburn's hand moved toward his holster, but before he could draw, a rifle cocked behind him. "I wouldn't," Garrett's voice came, cold and steady. He had approached silently from the direction of town, positioning himself perfectly to intervene. Blackburn froze, then slowly raised his hands. "Just having a conversation, Steele, no harm intended." "Conversation's over," Garrett replied. "Sheriff's on his way. You'll be facing charges for the stagecoach robbery, among other things." A curious expression crossed Blackburn's face, not anger or defiance as Tabitha might have expected, but something almost like relief. "Been running a long time," he said, more to himself than to them. "Gets tiresome after a while." The fight seemed to go out of him as Sheriff Ellis and several deputies arrived, weapons drawn. He submitted to arrest without resistance, allowing himself to be disarmed and led away toward the jail. "Strange," Tabitha commented as Garrett joined her, the children still huddled protectively behind their teacher. "It was almost as if he wanted to be caught. Some men create their own cages," Garrett observed, "then spend their lives looking for someone else to blame for the bars." The philosophical assessment surprised Tabitha, revealing yet another layer to the complex man she had come to love. "Is that what you were doing up in your cabin?" she asked gently. "Living in a cage of your own making?" Garrett's eyes met hers, honest and clear. "Yes," he admitted. "Until a half-frozen schoolteacher stumbled into my clearing and forced me to remember there was a world beyond my own pain." One of the children tugged at Tabitha's skirt, breaking the moment. "Miss Turner, can we continue our lesson now?" Tabitha smiled down at the little girl. "Yes, Clara." "Let's continue." She looked back at Garrett. "Will you join us? We're learning about how bees make honey." "Wouldn't miss it," he replied with a smile that transformed his face, erasing the last shadows of the vigilant, solitary man she had first met. As summer progressed toward autumn, Blackburn's capture and subsequent trial at the territorial court became old news, replaced by more immediate concerns: the harvest, preparations for winter, and the upcoming harvest festival that would mark the end of the growing season. For Tabitha and Garrett, however, a more personal milestone approached. On a golden September afternoon, with Shadow as ring-bearer, carrying the bands in a small pouch tied around his neck, and the entire town in attendance, they were married beneath the spreading branches of an ancient cottonwood tree by the creek that gave the settlement its name. Tabitha wore a simple dress of cream-colored silk sent by Mrs. Hollister's sister in Denver. Garrett, at the insistence of the townsmen, had submitted to a proper haircut and shave, revealing a face younger and more handsome than many had realized beneath his usual beard. "Never seen Steele smile so much," Sheriff Ellis commented to Mourning Dove, who had traveled from her family's camp to attend the ceremony. "Man's completely transformed. The heart knows its own healing," the older woman replied with quiet wisdom. "Sometimes it just needs the right medicine." After the simple ceremony and the community celebration that followed, Tabitha and Garrett returned to their home, no longer just the teacher's quarters, but a proper cabin Garrett had built adjacent to the schoolhouse, combining her need to be near her work with his preference for a dwelling of his own creation. As twilight settled over Silvercreek, they sat on the porch of their new home, watching the first stars appear in the deepening blue of the sky. Shadow lay at their feet, occasionally raising his head to track the movements of small nocturnal creatures beginning their nightly activities. "Happy?" Garrett asked, his arm around Tabitha's shoulders. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Though I still find it hard to believe sometimes how different my life is from what I imagined when I boarded that stagecoach in Cheyenne. Regrets?" He asked, a trace of old insecurity surfacing briefly. Tabitha turned to face him fully, her expression leaving no room for doubt. "Not one," she said firmly. "Every step of that journey, even the terrifying parts, led me exactly where I was meant to be." Garrett's kiss was gentle yet possessive, a perfect expression of the bond they had forged through danger and adversity. When they parted, he kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "When I found you in that storm," he confessed quietly, "I told Shadow she belongs to me not as a claim of ownership, but because something in me recognized you immediately. Like a part of myself I didn't know was missing until it appeared in my clearing, cursing at the snow." "I was not cursing," Tabitha protested automatically, then laughed at their recurring joke. "Well, perhaps a little. Most unladylike," Garrett teased, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Good thing you prefer women to ladies, then," she retorted, delighting in the freedom to be entirely herself with this man who loved her strength as much as her softness. "Good thing indeed," he agreed, drawing her close again as the first stars of evening winked into existence above them, each one, as her father had taught her, a hole in the floor of heaven letting light shine through. And in that moment, with Shadow at their feet and the promise of all their tomorrows stretching before them, Tabitha thought perhaps her father had been right after all. For surely this happiness found in the most unexpected circumstances, forged through hardship and danger, was a little piece of heaven itself, shining through the darkness of a world that often seemed cold and unforgiving, a light in the wilderness, a fire in the snow. A love neither had sought but both had found, against all odds, at exactly the moment they needed it most.